Welcome, traveler, to Boring History for Sleep, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Tonight's journey will carry us through the winter in the Middle Ages. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Winter in the Middle Ages was not a season that arrived politely or left on time, but a long grinding presence that pressed itself into every part of a poor person's life, shaping thought, movement, work, hunger, fear, and especially the fragile hours of sleep. Because winter was not something that happened outdoors while life continued safely inside, but something that crossed thresholds without resistance, slipping through walls of mud and wood, through ill-fitting doors, through roofs of straw and reed, until the distinction between inside and outside almost vanished. And for the poor this meant that from the first hard frost the world began to shrink. Not in imagination, but in possibility, as fields went silent, tools were set aside, wages disappeared, and days shortened into a narrow band of grey light that barely allowed work before darkness returned. And darkness mattered, because darkness carried cold with it. And cold was not an abstract discomfort. Because medieval cold was rarely dry and clean but wet, clinging, and relentless, rising from the earth, floors beneath sleeping bodies, condensing on walls, soaking clothing, and turning breath into mist that hung in the air. And this cold was made worse by the reality that medieval Europe, particularly from the later Middle Ages onward, endured long periods of harsher climate during what historians now call the Little Ice Age, when winters stretched longer, storms grew fiercer, and summers often failed to fully compensate, meaning that winter was not merely endured but anticipated with dread, because a single severe season could undo an entire household. And poor people understood this deeply, even if they lacked the language to explain climate cycles, because experience taught them that winter killed quietly, not always through dramatic freezing deaths, but through weakness, illness, hunger, and exhaustion that accumulated night after night, especially during sleep, when the body was still and vulnerable. And this vulnerability shaped how winter was perceived, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as an enemy that had to be survived one night at a time. And as autumn faded into early frost, households began a slow retreat inward. Because energy itself became a resource, and burning calories unnecessarily could mean hunger later, and hunger made cold far more dangerous, and so winter forced a narrowing of life, where choices became fewer and consequences sharper. And the poor, who lived without buffers or reserves, felt this narrowing first and most intensely, because their homes were thin, their clothing limited, and their margins non-existent. And these homes, often built of wattle and daub with thatched roofs and dirt floors, were never meant to keep out prolonged cold, only to provide basic shelter from wind and rain. And in winter they failed at even that, as wind slipped through cracks, smoke from the hearth hung heavy in the air, and moisture crept everywhere. And even when a fire was lit, it did not transform the space into warmth so much as create a small island of heat surrounded by cold. And once that fire died down, as it often did at night to conserve fuel, the cold returned immediately, filling the space without resistance. And this meant that nightfall carried a psychological weight as well as a physical one, because when the sun went down, the world became darker, colder, and quieter, and silence itself could feel threatening, broken only by wind, the crack of timber, or the cough of someone struggling to breathe in the smoky air. And sleep, which in warmer seasons might offer rest and recovery, became instead a careful negotiation, because sleeping too deeply risked letting the body temperature drop too far, while not sleeping at all led to exhaustion that made work impossible the next day. And this balance was never stable, shifting constantly as weather worsened, food ran low, and bodies weakened. And medieval people did not think of winter as a neutral passage of time, but as a test, sometimes framed in religious terms as God's will or punishment. but more often understood practically as a season that demanded obedience, patience, and endurance, because fighting winter directly was impossible, and even those who survived many winters knew that survival was never guaranteed, that age, sickness, or simple bad luck could tip the balance. And this awareness created a quiet tension that settled over poor communities as winter deepened, a shared understanding that hardship was coming and that there would be no easy escape from it. And this tension followed people into their homes and into their sleeping spaces, where families gathered closely, not out of affection but necessity, sharing body heat, sharing breath, sharing the small protection that proximity allowed, because isolation in winter could be deadly, and sleep itself became a communal act, not a private one, shaped by the need to conserve warmth and watch over the vulnerable. And even children learned early that winter nights were different, longer, colder, and filled with discomfort that had to be endured rather than complained about. And all of this meant that winter was not something that existed outside of daily life, but something that rewrote it entirely, reducing choices, hardening routines, and turning each night into a small trial, where survival depended on preparation, restraint, and a measure of luck. And when morning finally came, bringing a thin, cold light that crept slowly into the home, it was not greeted with joy so much as relief, because making it through another night meant the body had held on, the fire could be coaxed back to life, and the work of enduring winter could continue, one day and one night at a time, until the season finally loosened its grip, if it chose to do so at all. For the poor in the Middle Ages, the house itself was never a true barrier against winter, but a fragile shell that slowed the cold without ever stopping it, because most people did not live in solid stone buildings with thick walls and sealed windows, but in simple structures made quickly, cheaply, and with whatever materials were available nearby. And these homes were built for survival in general, not comfort in winter, consisting most often of wooden frames packed with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches, mud, straw, and animal dung, which dried hard but cracked easily, opening countless small gaps through which wind slipped freely, and the roofs, usually thatched with reeds or straw, shed rain but did little to block cold air, especially once age, rot, or storms loosened them. And beneath everything lay bare earth floors, sometimes hardened with clay, sometimes covered with rushes, but always cold, always damp, always pulling heat downward from sleeping bodies. And this meant that even when people were indoors, they were never truly sheltered from winter, because the boundary between outside and inside was thin, porous, and unreliable. And when storms arrived, they announced themselves clearly inside the home through whistling drafts, dripping water, and shifting timbers, and there were no glass windows to seal the space, only wooden shutters, cloth, or oiled parchment, all of which let air pass through, and doors rarely fit their frames well, swelling in wet weather and shrinking in cold, leaving gaps large enough to feel with a hand. And these houses were not designed with insulation in mind, because insulation as a concept barely existed. And even if people understood the value of trapping heat, they lacked the materials and resources to do so effectively. And so cold settled into the structure itself, turning walls into reservoirs of chill that radiated cold inward long after nightfall. And dampness made this worse, because rain and melting frost soaked into walls and floors, lowering temperatures further and creating a clammy cold that clung to skin and clothing. And this environment shaped how people moved and lived indoors during winter, as they stayed close to the hearth when it burned, avoided unused corners of the house, and learned instinctively where the cold pooled most deeply. And yet even the hearth did not transform these spaces into warmth, because smoke often filled the room without a proper chimney, forcing families to choose between warmth and breathable air. And when the fire died down at night, the house cooled rapidly, sometimes within minutes, as if it had been waiting for the chance. And for the poor there was rarely another option, because rebuilding homes to better standards required time, labor, and materials they did not have. And landlords had little incentive to improve peasant housing, and so generation after generation lived and slept in structures that barely resisted winter, accepting discomfort as normal, and danger as unavoidable. And this meant that the house, which should have been a refuge, became instead another participant in winter's assault. offering just enough shelter to survive in good years, but failing quickly in bad ones. And when people lay down to sleep within these walls, they did so knowing that the house would not protect them completely, that the cold would return once the fire faded, and that the night would test both the structure and the bodies inside it, until morning came again. The hearth was the center of the medieval poor household in winter, not because it offered comfort in the modern sense, but because it represented the only fragile line between life and cold. And even that line was unreliable, dangerous, and costly to maintain, because fire required fuel, and fuel required labor, time, access, or money, all of which were in short supply for the poor. And so the hearth was never simply a place of warmth, but a site of constant calculation, where families weighed heat against hunger, light against safety, and warmth against the risk of fire or suffocation. And in most poor homes, the hearth was not built into a wall with a chimney, but sat directly on the earth floor, an open fire burning beneath a simple smoke hole in the roof, if one existed at all. And this meant that smoke did not politely exit the building, but lingered, curled, and spread, filling the interior with a thick haze that stung the eyes. And cold was often worse, and so people learned to live with burning eyes, persistent coughs and headaches as part of winter life, especially at night when the fire was most needed and ventilation was poorest, and the hearth's heat itself was uneven and limited, radiating strongly only within a short distance, leaving the edges of the room cold and dark. And this created invisible boundaries inside the house zones where people clustered close to the fire, and areas that were avoided entirely during winter nights, because standing or sleeping too far from the hearth meant feeling the cold immediately seep back into the body. And even when the fire burned brightly, it did not warm the house so much as temporarily warm the air near it, while walls, floors, and for poor families, the question of whether to keep the fire burning through the night was never simple, because wood was precious, especially in winter when gathering it was harder and sometimes restricted by law, and cutting would illegally risk punishment, fines, or worse. And even when wood was available, it had to be dried, stored, and rationed, and burning too much one night could mean having too little later in the season. And so many households allowed the fire to die down before sleeping, banking embers under ash in the hope of rekindling it in the morning, accepting the cold as the price of conservation. And this decision shaped the experience of sleep itself, because without an active fire, the house cooled rapidly, breath became visible, and the cold from the ground rose steadily into bodies lying still. And those who chose to keep the fire alive all night faced different dangers. And entire houses could be lost to fire in minutes, especially during winter storms when wind fed flames aggressively. And beyond fire itself, there was the danger of smoke, because without proper chimneys, smoke accumulated, especially overnight when doors and shutters were closed to keep out cold, and prolonged exposure damaged lungs and could lead to dizziness, unconsciousness, or death. Though people did not understand this in modern terms, only recognizing that some nights people failed to wake, and this uncertainty made the hearth a source of anxiety as much as relief. And yet, despite all these risks, the hearth remained indispensable, because without it there was no cooking, no hot food, no warm drink, and no chance of drying wet clothes. And hot food mattered deeply in winter, because warm meals provided not just calories, but a temporary sense of warmth that spread from the stomach outward, offering brief relief from the cold that seeped into everything. And this made the hearth the center of evening life, where families gathered after dark, repairing tools, mending clothes, telling stories, or simply sitting in silence, conserving energy and watching the fire slowly shrink as fuel ran low. And when it was finally time to sleep, the decision about the fire had already shaped the night ahead, determining how cold the house would become, how long warmth would last, and how often people might wake shivering. And in this way, the hearth governed the rhythm of winter nights, not as a steady source of comfort but as a fragile, flickering defense that demanded constant attention, constant trade-offs, and constant acceptance of risk. And even in the best circumstances, the hearth could not overcome the fundamental limitations of poor housing, because heat rose and escaped through the roof, smoke holes leaked air in both directions, and walls absorbed cold relentlessly. And so the fire's influence was temporary and localized, creating moments of warmth rather than lasting protection. And this meant that the poor never experienced winter nights as fully warmed or secure, but as cycles of brief comfort followed by long stretches of cold. Making the hours after midnight the coldest and most dangerous, when the fire was lowest or gone entirely, and it was during these hours that coughing worsened, joints stiffened, as something that could be pushed back briefly with flame, but never fully defeated, only endured until morning came again. Sleeping fully clothed was not a choice for the medieval poor, but a necessity imposed by cold, scarcity. And changing clothes offered no benefit when everything was equally cold and damp, and so people slept in the same woolen tunics, leggings, hoods, and cloaks they wore during the day, often stiff with dirt, smoke, and sweat. And beneath the wool there might be a thin linen shift or shirt, which offered little insulation but protected the skin from chafing. And this layering was critical, because medieval clothing was not tailored for warmth in isolation, but relied on accumulation, on trapping small pockets of air between layers, and the more layers one had, the better one fared, which meant that the poorest who owned the fewest garments suffered the most. And clothing was not removed before sleep, because undressing meant exposing skin to freezing air inside homes that were barely warmer than outdoors. And once layers were removed, fingers quickly lost dexterity, making it harder to dress again, especially in darkness. And so people lay down already bundled, belts sometimes still fastened, hoods pulled low, cloaks wrapped tightly around bodies like crude blankets, and boots occasionally left on when feet were numb and swollen, because removing footwear risked not being able to put it back on by morning, and sleeping clothing was uncomfortable, restrictive, and far from restful. But it was safer than sleeping lightly dressed, because the body lost heat rapidly when still, and medieval people understood this instinctively, even if they could not explain it scientifically. And this practice shaped the experience of sleep itself, because bodies never fully relaxed, muscles remained tense under layers, and pressure points formed where stiff fabric folded beneath weight. And yet, this discomfort was accepted as normal, because warmth mattered more than ease, and clothing served another function at night, acting as a barrier against insects, rodents, and drafts, which were constant companions in poor homes. And in winter, mice sought warmth indoors, crawling over sleeping bodies, while lice and fleas thrived in layered clothing that was rarely cleaned, making nights restless and itchy. Meaning that fit was poor, and seams rubbed raw skin during long nights of immobility. And yet these same worn clothes represented security, because they were familiar, trusted, and known to provide at least some protection against cold. And this reliance on clothing extended to the use of hats and hoods during sleep. And so even children slept with heads wrapped, breath fogging the air beneath the fabric. And in households where blankets were thin or absent, clothing became the primary defense against night cold, and people arranged themselves strategically, tucking edges beneath bodies, overlapping cloaks, and pressing close to others to trap shared warmth. And this meant that clothing was not just worn but actively managed during sleep, adjusted repeatedly through the night as bodies shifted and temperatures dropped. and all of this contributed to a form of rest that was shallow and fragmented, where true relaxation was impossible. But endurance was achieved through habit, and over time, sleeping clothes became so ingrained that undressing at night may have felt unnatural or even dangerous, because vulnerability in winter was associated with exposure, and exposure led quickly to sickness or worse. And so for the medieval poor, clothing was not something set aside at the end of the day, but could be resisted, layer by layer, until morning light returned once again. Beds, in the way we imagine them now, were rare luxuries for the medieval poor, and winter exposed this absence brutally, because most people did not sleep raised above the ground on framed mattresses, but on simple straw. Pallets laid directly on earth floors, or on low wooden boards that offered little separation from the cold beneath. And these pallets were nothing more than sacks or rough covers stuffed with straw, dried leaves, or rushes, materials chosen not for comfort but because they were cheap and available. And while straw did trap a small amount of air at first, it flattened quickly under the weight of the body, losing what little insulation it offered. And as winter wore on, the straw absorbed moisture from the ground, from damp air, and from breath, becoming cold, heavy, and sour-smelling. And yet replacing it was not simple, because fresh straw was a resource tied to harvest cycles, and by deep winter there was little to spare, and so people slept on bedding that steadily degraded, night after night, until it was more symbolic than effective. And beneath these pallets lay the dirt floor itself, which was always cold in winter, sometimes frozen hard, sometimes wet and muddy, and this cold radiated upward, relentlessly, pulling heat from bodies that lay still for hours, and no matter how many layers were worn, the ground always won eventually. And this meant that the cold felt different from above and below, seeping downward from the air and upward from the earth at the same time, trapping sleepers between two sources of chill. And some households attempted small improvements, scattering rushes or reeds beneath pallets, or raising bedding slightly on boards or crates. But these measures only delayed the inevitable, because without true insulation, the earth remained an active source of cold. And this made sleep a constant process of adjustment, shifting positions, curling tightly, drawing knees to chest, because lying stretched out exposed more surface area to the ground and hastened heat loss. And children learned this instinctively, curling into tight bundles beside parents or siblings, while adults slept stiffly, conserving warmth rather than seeking comfort. And straw bedding carried other risks as well, because it attracted insects and rodents seeking warmth, and in winter mice nested within pallets, sometimes biting sleepers, sometimes simply rustling through the night, breaking already fragile sleep. And fleas thrived in straw and layered clothing, making nights itchy and restless. But these irritations were tolerated because alternatives were few, and feather-filled mattresses, which offered real insulation, were far beyond the reach of the poor, reserved for wealthy households or religious institutions. And even wooden bed frames with ropes or boards were uncommon in the lowest classes, meaning that most people accepted ground-level sleeping as normal, even though it exposed them to the worst of winter's cold. And over time this took a toll on the body, because sleeping on hard, cold surfaces stiffened joints, aggravated old injuries, and worsened chronic pain, especially among those who worked physically during the day. And winter mornings were often marked by slow, painful movement as bodies struggled to warm and loosen again. And yet, despite all this, straw pallets remained central to winter survival, not because they worked well, but because they worked just enough, offering a thin buffer between flesh and frozen earth. And when people lay down at night, they did so knowing that the ground beneath them would draw warmth steadily until morning, and that sleep would be light, interrupted, and uncomfortable, but still necessary, because even poor sleep was better than none, and endurance, not rest, was the true function of the medieval winter bed. Sleeping together in winter was not driven by intimacy or affection, but by a clear understanding that shared warmth increased the chances of survival. And for the medieval poor, this meant that privacy was sacrificed without hesitation, because the cold did not care about personal space. And in homes with only one room, or sometimes two at most, entire families gathered into the smallest possible sleeping area once night fell, arranging bodies close together to trap and retain heat. And parents slept beside children, older siblings beside younger ones, and in some cases extended family members or lodgers joined as well, because every additional body contributed warmth, and this closeness was practical rather than comforting, because bodies pressed together restricted movement, made breathing the smoky air more difficult, and amplified discomfort. But it also slowed the loss of heat that came so quickly when sleeping alone, and medieval people understood this instinctively, even if they never articulated it as a principle. And children learned early that winter nights meant sharing space whether they wished to or not, because separating sleepers created cold pockets that the house could not overcome, and in extreme cold people even adjusted their sleeping arrangements, further pulling pallets closer to the hearth, overlapping bedding and positioning the weakest, usually children or the elderly, in the center where warmth was greatest, while stronger adults took the colder edges. And this unspoken hierarchy reflected an awareness of risk, because not everyone could be protected equally, and those most likely to survive absorbed the worst of the cold, to shield those less resilient. And in some rural households, animals were brought inside during severe weather, not out of kindness but necessity, because a cow, goat, or sheep produced significant body heat, and stabling them indoors could raise the temperature slightly, enough to matter during freezing nights. And while this added noise, smell, and the risk of disease, it was often worth it, because warmth outweighed discomfort. And this arrangement blurred the line between human and animal spaces, reinforcing how survival took precedence over cleanliness or order. And communal sleeping also meant shared breathing, shared coughs, and shared illness. And in winter, respiratory diseases spread easily through close quarters, especially in smoke-filled rooms. But isolation was rarely an option, because sleeping alone increased the risk of hypothermia, and so families accepted the trade-off, choosing warmth even if it meant sickness later. And this practice shaped the emotional experience of winter nights, because sleep was never solitary or quiet, but filled with the sounds of breathing, coughing, shifting bodies, and occasional crying, and privacy simply did not exist. And yet this closeness created a sense of collective endurance, where surviving the night was something done together rather than individually. And waking in the morning meant counting who had made it through, sometimes literally. And while this might seem harsh, it reflected a practical understanding of winter's dangers, because the cold punished isolation most severely, and communal sleeping reduced that risk, even if it stripped away comfort, autonomy, and rest. And over generations this practice became normalized, embedded into the rhythms of winter life, so that sleeping together was not questioned but assumed, a necessary adaptation to an environment where warmth was scarce, and bodies were the most reliable source of it. And when people lay down at night, pressed close to one another, it was not out of choice but calculation, a quiet agreement that survival was easier when faced together, even in the dark, even in discomfort, even as the cold pressed in from all sides. Blankets were a luxury the poor could rarely afford, and in winter this absence became painfully obvious, because the cold did not wait for the body to grow tired or settle into sleep. It seeped in relentlessly, creeping through cracks in walls, drifting in under doors, and pooling along the cold earth floors. And without substantial coverings, nights were long, shivering affairs where warmth was borrowed from what little clothing, bodies, and hearth heat remained. And even when a family possessed blankets, these were often thin woolen sheets, patched and repatched until they were threadbare, rough against skin, and uneven in their protection. And heavier coverings made from multiple layers were rarely available, because weaving and wool were costly, and mostly reserved for wealthier households, and people made do with what they had, draping old cloaks, woven cloths, or even burlap sacks over sleeping bodies, knowing that any coverage was better than none. And positioning mattered as much as material, because blankets were not wide enough to cover everyone fully, and adults often had to share a single piece of cloth, tucking corners beneath bodies, overlapping layers, and adjusting repeatedly during the night as limbs shifted, heads turned, or children squirmed. And even then the warmth was uneven, concentrated where bodies touched, and leaving edges cold, stiff, and icy. And in some households, blankets were reserved for the weakest members, usually children or the elderly, leaving others exposed, because families knew that human bodies could generate heat if pressed together. But feathers, down, or thick wool could not always be stretched to cover everyone. And this meant that even within a single bed, some portions of a body were protected while others were left to shiver. And the act of sharing blankets became a nightly negotiation, often silent, sometimes tense, as each person claimed enough space to trap warmth without stealing it entirely from another. And nights were punctuated by the rustling of shifting cloth, the soft complaints of cold fingers or toes, the quiet rearrangement of layers to preserve what little warmth remained, because the poor had learned over generations that blankets alone would not stop winter, but could slow its reach enough to allow survival. Even when blankets existed in sufficient quantity, they rarely worked as intended, because moisture and cold conspired against them, and wool that was thick and warm during dry weather lost much of its insulating power once damp, and dampness was unavoidable, seeping in from melted snow trapped inside, from condensation in poorly ventilated homes, from the cold breath that hung heavily over sleeping bodies, and from straw pallets and rush-covered floors that never fully dried. And once blankets absorbed this moisture, they grew heavy, clinging and unyielding, turning into cold sheets that dragged against skin and stole warmth rather than preserving it. And people responded by layering, doubling, even tripling coverings where possible, tucking edges under bodies, pressing sheets together, and creating makeshift quilts from clothing, rags, and anything soft available. But these layers made sleep restrictive, bending joints awkwardly, compressing muscles, and forcing bodies into positions chosen for warmth rather than comfort. And yet no one complained aloud, because discomfort was preferable to the alternative: exposure to the bitter, penetrating cold that seeped under the door, through the thatch, along the walls, and into bones. Children suffered most in these conditions, because even multiple blankets could not fully compensate for their smaller bodies, and parents often pressed them into the center of layered bedding arrangements to absorb shared heat, leaving adults at the periphery, where drafts were strongest and warmth weakest. And this arrangement required constant attention, because one restless child could shift layers, pull blankets off, or expose a sibling to the cold. And the response was immediate: hands readjusting cloth, limbs moving back into place murmured reassurances, and a silent vigilance that lasted long into the night, because no one could afford to sleep unconcerned, and winter nights were long measured in hours of quiet suffering, punctuated by small movements to maintain warmth, and sometimes punctuated by groans or coughs as bodies adjusted to the dual pressures of cold and heavy layers. And in houses without multiple blankets, improvisation became essential, using cloaks, animal hides, sacks, or even straw itself as padding or covering, arranging them so that weight pressed gently on bodies, conserving warmth by trapping air, and attempting to insulate as much as possible without creating a suffocating or damp layer that would worsen the chill, because air trapped in dry material held warmth, but air trapped in damp layers held cold. And learning this distinction was a matter of life and death in long, freezing nights. Blankets also had symbolic value in a household, marking what little security remained in winter, because the presence of any covering suggested planning, resourcefulness, and care, and the absence of sufficient blankets highlighted scarcity and vulnerability, a daily reminder of the household's fragility against the elements. And even the act of acquiring, mending, or layering blankets required effort and foresight, because families had to balance work, trade, and household chores with preparing bedding for the approaching nights. And the work did not end when night fell, because blankets had to be adjusted, layers readjusted, and positions shifted to maintain maximum coverage, especially as the cold deepened in the hours after midnight, when the hearth embers cooled and the house surrendered to the chill. And during these times, blankets became the primary defense, more critical than clothing or even body heat, because they were the only layer separating flesh from relentless winter, and without them, hypothermia and frostbite were constant threats, invisible yet present, creeping into joints, muscles, and skin while bodies lay still. And this reality shaped sleep into a form of active endurance, a constant negotiation with material, body, and environment, where comfort was secondary and survival primary. And nights were measured not in dreams or restfulness, but in breaths, movements, and the slow persistence of warmth held just enough to keep the body alive until dawn. Families also discovered that blankets were imperfect because of their size, which rarely matched the needs of an entire household, and in the coldest nights, one blanket might cover only 2 people, leaving others exposed. And this forced ingenuity, as people twisted, folded, or shared pieces to cover the most vulnerable, layering children in the center, adults at the edges, and occasionally sliding animals under or alongside humans to share heat, because bodies in close proximity produced more warmth than any material could. And yet this practice brought its own difficulties, as shifting limbs, restless children, or the sheer weight of multiple bodies and layers caused constant adjustment, a nocturnal choreography of survival that rarely allowed deep rest, and even small movements risked exposing someone to cold, prompting immediate reactions, tugging, repositioning, and recovering, in an unspoken understanding that no night could be left unattended, because winter punished the inattentive swiftly and without mercy. The quality of blankets themselves varied widely, depending on what a family could obtain, which was often tied to occupation, location, and fortune, and this meant that even households with multiple coverings might have some that were coarse, itchy, or unevenly woven, producing not warmth but irritation, scratching skin, catching hair, and occasionally causing bruises or red marks on sensitive areas like wrists, shoulders, and neck. Yet these discomforts were endured silently, because a rough blanket still held heat, and even a single layer was better than none, and families patched holes with scraps of cloth, stitched together old garments, or even braided strips of fabric into makeshift covers, often creating a patchwork of textures, thicknesses, and densities that was unpredictable in its warmth, but still served a critical function, because the alternative, sleeping exposed, was simply not survivable in deep winter. And these patches became familiar companions, their smells, textures, and weight integrated into the nightly ritual, comforting in their predictability, even as they failed to fully defend against frost and damp. Weight was also a critical factor in blankets, because the pressure of heavy material pressed against the body, helping retain heat by limiting airflow, but simultaneously restricting movement, and this created another challenge, finding a balance between sufficient coverage and mobility, so that limbs could be adjusted without losing the trapped warmth, which was particularly tricky when multiple people shared a single blanket or when blankets were layered unevenly, producing pockets of cold that required constant attention. And in some houses, blankets were supplemented with additional insulation like straw, animal hides, or even sacks, placed strategically beneath or over the body to provide extra protection. But these solutions added bulk, restricted movement, and required careful positioning each night, a small but necessary exercise in survival engineering that families repeated religiously, because failure to do so could mean losing enough warmth to fall ill or even die in the coldest months. Even the way people slept in blankets was affected by winter's demands, because curling tightly preserved heat, pressing together preserved warmth, and positioning the body to avoid drafts was essential, and adults learned to anticipate the pull of cold from walls, floors, and roof, arranging themselves and their children to block the chill as effectively as possible, often improvising barriers from clothing, household objects, or additional coverings, creating an ad hoc microclimate within the room, where every inch mattered, where blankets were not just passive coverings but active tools in the nightly contest with winter. And the struggle was not one of comfort but of endurance, a strategy repeated night after night, week after week, month after month, until the thaw of spring finally arrived. And even then, the relief was partial, because memories of the long nights, the damp, the thin, patched blankets, and the relentless cold lingered, shaping behavior, expectations, and the human understanding of winter for generations. Sleep under blankets was also never uninterrupted. Every creak of timber, whistle of wind, or cough of a sibling prompted movement, tugging, and readjustment, because cold was not evenly distributed, and warmth had to be actively managed, with shifting, layering, and pressing against others, a constant negotiation in which no one slept deeply for long. And this pattern produced a state of near-constant awareness, where even in sleep the body responded to temperature changes, repositioned itself to trap warmth, and reacted to the shifting environment. And this made winter nights both physically exhausting and mentally taxing, because even rest required effort, vigilance, and calculation, and people learned to sleep lightly, with one ear tuned to danger or discomfort, and one hand or foot ready to adjust, tuck, or cover as needed. And children, though smaller, were taught early how to maneuver within the layers, how to preserve heat, and how to survive discomfort, because survival in winter was learned, practiced, and repeated from a young age, and it was taught not through instruction, but through experience, observation, and necessity. Finally, blankets were more than just practical items. They carried social and psychological significance. Having any blanket at all signified that a family had prepared, had planning, and had the resourcefulness to assemble some form of protection. And this small security mattered in an otherwise harsh and unpredictable world. And families who lacked even a single layer faced heightened anxiety, because the threat of cold was immediate and unrelenting, and nights could feel endless, stretching on in darkness, punctuated by shivers, groans, and the constant negotiation of warmth. And over time, the presence or absence of blankets, the way they were layered, shared, and managed, became a rhythm, a nightly ritual of survival, teaching children, reinforcing habits, and structuring domestic life around the inescapable demands of winter. And even in spring, when warmth returned, the lessons of blankets endured, shaping how people prepared, slept, and survived in every subsequent cold season. Because in medieval winters, blankets were never mere comfort, they were a lifeline. Thin, patched, fragile, and invaluable, holding heat, shaping behavior, and marking the boundary between life and cold in a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where every night was a negotiation, every layer counted, and every small measure of warmth could make the difference between enduring another day or succumbing to the relentless season. Blankets were a luxury the poor could rarely afford, and in winter this absence became painfully obvious because the cold did not wait for the body to grow tired or settle into sleep. It seeped in relentlessly, creeping through cracks in walls, drifting in under doors, and pooling along the cold earth floors. And without substantial coverings, nights were long, shivering affairs where warmth was borrowed from what little clothing, bodies, and hearth heat remained. And even when a family possessed blankets, these were often thin woolen sheets, patched and repatched until they were threadbare, rough against skin, and uneven in their protection. And heavier coverings made from multiple layers were rarely available, because weaving and wool were costly, labor-intensive, and mostly reserved for wealthier households, and people made do with what they had, draping old cloaks, woven cloths, or even burlap sacks over sleeping bodies, knowing that any coverage was better than none. And positioning mattered as much as material, because blankets were not wide enough to cover everyone fully, and adults often had to share a single piece of cloth, tucking corners beneath bodies, overlapping layers, and adjusting repeatedly during the night as limbs shifted, heads turned, or children squirmed. And even then the warmth was uneven, concentrated where bodies touched, and leaving edges cold, stiff, and icy. And in some households blankets were reserved for the weakest members, usually children or the elderly, leaving others exposed, because families knew that human bodies could generate heat if pressed together, but feathers down, or thick wool could not always be stretched to cover everyone. And this meant that even within a single bed, some portions of a body were protected, while others were left to shiver. And the act of sharing blankets became a nightly negotiation, often silent, sometimes tense, as each person claimed enough space to trap warmth without stealing it entirely from another. And nights were punctuated by the rustling of shifting cloth, the soft complaints of cold fingers or toes, the quiet rearrangement of layers to preserve what little warmth remained, because the poor had learned over generations that blankets alone would not stop winter but could slow its reach enough to allow survival. And families also discovered that blankets were imperfect because of their size, which rarely matched the needs of an entire household. And in the coldest nights, one blanket might cover only 2 people, leaving others exposed. And this forced ingenuity, as people twisted, folded, or shared pieces to cover the most vulnerable, layering children in the center, adults at the edges, and occasionally sliding animals under or alongside humans to share heat, because bodies in close proximity produced more warmth than any material could. And yet this practice brought its own difficulties, as shifting limbs, restless children, or the sheer weight of multiple bodies and layers caused constant adjustment, a nocturnal choreography of survival that rarely allowed deep rest. And even small movements risked exposing someone to cold, prompting immediate reactions, tugging, repositioning, and recovering, in an unspoken understanding that no night could be left unattended, because winter punished the inattentive swiftly and without mercy. The quality of blankets themselves varied widely, depending on what a family could obtain, which was often tied to occupation, location, and fortune. And this meant that even households with multiple coverings might have some that were coarse, itchy, or unevenly woven, producing not warmth but irritation, scratching skin, catching hair, and occasionally causing bruises or red marks on sensitive areas like wrists, shoulders, and neck. Yet these discomforts were endured silently, because a rough blanket still held heat, and even a single layer was better than none. And families patched holes with scraps of cloth, stitched together old garments, or even braided strips of fabric into makeshift covers, often creating a patchwork of textures, thicknesses, and densities that was unpredictable in its warmth. and weight integrated into the nightly ritual, comforting in their predictability even as they failed to fully defend against frost and damp. And weight was also a critical factor in blankets, because the pressure of heavy material pressed against the body, helping retain heat by limiting airflow, but simultaneously restricting movement. And this created another challenge, finding a balance between sufficient coverage and mobility, so that limbs could be adjusted without losing the trapped warmth, which was particularly tricky when multiple people shared a single blanket or when blankets were layered unevenly, producing pockets of cold that required constant attention. And in some houses, blankets were supplemented with additional insulation like straw, animal hides, or sacks, placed strategically beneath or over the body to provide extra protection. But these solutions added bulk-restricted movement and required careful positioning each night, a small but necessary exercise in survival engineering that families repeated religiously, because failure to do so could mean losing enough warmth to fall ill or even die in the coldest months. Even the way people slept in blankets was affected by winter's demands, because curling tightly preserved heat, pressing together preserved warmth, and positioning the body to avoid drafts was essential. Often improvising barriers from clothing, household objects, or additional coverings, creating an ad hoc microclimate within the room, where every inch mattered, where blankets were not just passive coverings, but active tools in the nightly contest with winter. And the struggle was not one of comfort, but of endurance, a strategy repeated night after night, week after week, month after month, until the thaw of spring finally arrived. And even then, the relief was partial, because memories of the long nights, the damp, the thin, patched blankets, and the relentless cold lingered, shaping behavior, expectations, and the human understanding of winter. For generations, and families also discovered that blankets were imperfect because of their size, which rarely matched the needs of an entire household. And in the coldest nights, one blanket might cover only 2 people, leaving others exposed. And this forced ingenuity as people twisted, folded, or shared pieces to cover the most vulnerable, layering children in the center, adults at the edges, and occasionally sliding animals under or alongside humans to share heat, because bodies in close proximity produced more warmth than any material could. And yet this practice brought its own difficulties, as shifting limbs, restless children, or the sheer weight of multiple bodies and layers caused constant adjustment, a nocturnal choreography of survival that rarely allowed deep rest. And even small movements risked exposing someone to cold, prompting immediate reactions, tugging, repositioning, and recovering, in an unspoken understanding that no night could be left unattended, because winter punished the inattentive swiftly and without mercy. Sleep under blankets was also never uninterrupted. Every creak of timber, whistle of wind, or cough of a sibling prompted movement, tugging, and readjustment, because cold was not evenly distributed and warmth had to be actively managed, with shifting, layering, and pressing against others, a constant negotiation in which no one slept deeply for long. And this pattern produced a state of near constant awareness, where even in sleep, the body responded to temperature changes, repositioned itself to trap warmth, and reacted to the shifting environment. And this made winter nights both physically exhausting and mentally taxing, because even rest required effort, vigilance, and calculation, and people learned to sleep lightly with one ear tuned to danger or discomfort and one hand or foot ready to adjust, tuck, or cover as needed. And children, though smaller, were taught early how to maneuver within the layers, how to preserve heat, and how to survive discomfort, because survival in winter was learned, practiced, and repeated from a young age. And it was taught, not through instruction, but through experience, observation, and necessity. And finally, blankets were more than just practical items. They carried social and psychological significance. Having any blanket at all signified that a family had prepared, had planning, and had the resourcefulness to assemble some form of protection, and the absence of sufficient blankets highlighted scarcity and vulnerability, a daily reminder of the household's fragility against the elements. And even the act of acquiring, mending, or layering blankets required effort and foresight, because families had to balance work, trade, and household chores with preparing bedding for the approaching nights. And the work did not end when night fell, because blankets had to be adjusted, layers readjusted, and positions shifted to maintain maximum coverage, especially as the cold deepened in the hours after midnight, when the hearth embers cooled and the house surrendered to the chill. And during these times, blankets became the primary defense, more critical than clothing or even body heat, because they were the only layer separating flesh from relentless winter, and without them, hypothermia and frostbite were constant threats, invisible yet present, creeping into joints, muscles, and skin while bodies lay still. And this reality shaped sleep into a form of active endurance, a constant negotiation with material, body, and environment, where comfort was secondary and survival primary, and nights were measured not in dreams or restfulness but in breaths, movements, and the slow persistence of warmth, held just enough to keep the body alive until dawn. And over time, the presence or absence of blankets, the way they were layered, shared, and managed, became a rhythm, a nightly ritual of survival, teaching children, reinforcing habits, and structuring domestic life around the inescapable demands of winter. And even in spring, when warmth returned, the lessons of blankets endured, shaping how people prepared, slept, and survived in every subsequent cold season. Because in medieval winters, blankets were never mere comfort, they were a lifeline, thin, patched, fragile, and invaluable, holding heat, shaping behavior, and marking the boundary between life and cold, in a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where every night was a negotiation, every layer counted, and every small measure of warmth could make the difference between enduring another day or succumbing to the relentless season. For those without a hearth, or with little fuel, the night was the hardest enemy, because fire was the only reliable source of warmth, and without it, the cold became absolute, creeping through every crack, under every door, and across every bare floor. And the poor learned early that surviving a fireless night required strategy, preparation, and constant vigilance, because once the fire died, the house surrendered to frost, and the human body, no matter how clothed or layered, could not resist the chill for long. And in such circumstances, people relied entirely on body heat, blankets, clothing, and the architecture of their sleeping arrangements, pressing close together, curling tightly, and layering as much material as they could find, from cloaks to sacks, from straw to rags, and even animal hides, because any barrier between skin and the cold air mattered. And yet, even these measures were imperfect, because the cold was relentless, moving through every pore of the structure, through walls, ceilings, and floors, and through the breaths and movement of sleepers. Tiny actions repeated unconsciously throughout the night, a choreography of survival that rarely allowed deep sleep. And this constant negotiation with cold was tiring, physically and mentally, and children learned it early, curling against adults, pressing limbs into corners of blankets, and holding on to small scraps of warmth. And adults learned too, balancing comfort against survival. A gap in coverage could mean hours of shivering, the creeping numbness of extremities, and the risk of frostbite, illness, or even death. And winter nights without fire were measured in endurance, not dreams, and the body adapted as best it could, reducing circulation to extremities, curling tightly, and clinging to shared heat, while the mind remained partially alert, reacting to temperature shifts, drafts, or the subtle shift of others under blankets. Because unconsciousness brought vulnerability, and awareness, even half-sleep, became a shield, and families developed routines to cope. Children were placed in the center, adults at the edges, blankets arranged strategically, and sometimes small containers of embers from the dying hearth were kept nearby to rekindle a weak flame in the early hours. But these measures were risky, because sparks could ignite straw, rushes, or clothing, and without supervision, a fire meant danger as much as warmth. And so nights without fire were managed cautiously, with constant attention to position, coverage, and body contact. And the poor became masters of improvisation, using whatever they had to create microclimates of warmth within frigid spaces, pressing together, layering materials, and creating small pockets of shared heat that slowed the advance of cold, but never stopped it entirely. because the walls, roof, and floor continued to draw warmth inexorably, and frost crept in, dampness clung, and the night lengthened interminably, measured in a subtle progression of cold seeping through toes, knees, and fingers, through muscles and joints, into the marrow itself, and waking became inevitable, not always from dreams, but from shivering, numbness, or the instinct to adjust. And these awakenings required action, repositioning, tugging blankets, curling again, and holding closer to others, because survival depended on these tiny, repeated acts, and over time, people became attuned to the rhythm of winter nights, understanding instinctively when the body needed movement, when layering needed adjustment, and when shared heat had to be maximized. And children internalized these lessons quickly, understanding that small errors, a blanket slipping, a limb uncovered, a poorly positioned pallet, could have serious consequences, and over time, these habits became instinctive, encoded into every action during the long months of frost, and the cold itself became a teacher, harsh, unrelenting, and unforgettable, imprinting survival strategies that persisted across generations, and the poor developed rituals, routines, and unspoken codes of conduct designed to maximize warmth, minimize illness, and preserve life, because they could not rely on luck, medicine, or luxury. And even minor successes like keeping a child's toes warm, preventing shivering in the center of the night, or preserving a thin layer of heat within a patchwork blanket were celebrated silently as victories in the ongoing war against winter. And these small victories shaped the collective psychology of families, reinforcing endurance, resourcefulness, and constant attentiveness, because failure could not be afforded, and illness could strike with no warning, turning a single cold night into days of fever, weakness, or death. And the poor learned to anticipate this, preparing bedding, clothing, and spaces for worst-case scenarios, moving embers to prolong warmth, adjusting positions repeatedly through the night, and using shared heat with precision, pressing bodies together in strategic ways, layering blankets and clothing with careful attention to gaps, and improvising with whatever materials were at hand, from straw to burlap, animal hides to old garments, because survival depended on the efficient use of every fragment of warmth. And this efficiency required knowledge, observation, and instinct honed over years. And families passed this knowledge quietly, teaching children through example rather than explanation, through nightly practice rather than formal instruction, because every night was a test, and lessons learned too late could be fatal. And as a result, the rhythms of winter shaped life profoundly, structuring daily routines, social interactions, and family hierarchies around the constant negotiation with cold and illness. And over decades, these patterns became part of the cultural memory of communities, embedded in stories, rituals, and practices, because winter was never abstract or distant. It was an immediate, tangible, and unavoidable force, and survival depended on anticipating its demands with precision, patience, and endurance. And even as people slept lightly, adjusted blankets, and monitored children or the elderly, the cold persisted, and the danger of sickness remained, lurking invisibly in the damp air, the chilled floors, and the exhausted bodies pressed together. And yet, despite these hardships, people endured, developing resilience, creativity, and quiet heroism in the face of relentless winter. And this resilience was built not in comfort, but in adversity, where the smallest measures of heat, the careful layering of clothing, the strategic use of blankets, and the shared body warmth became vital instruments of life itself. And over time, these adaptations shaped how families interacted, how households were arranged, and how individuals perceived the natural world, because survival was inseparable from awareness, and every night demanded vigilance, movement, and improvisation, and even small mistakes could have cascading consequences for health, warmth, and life. And so generations of the poor learned to sleep in a heightened state of alertness, moving minimally but purposefully, layering strategically, monitoring children and elders, adjusting positions, and preserving warmth wherever possible. And through this unbroken cycle of cold, vigilance, and adaptation, the human body and mind were conditioned to endure. And the nights, though harsh, became structured by the rhythms of necessity, by shared warmth, by improvisation, and by the constant negotiation with cold and illness. And even when the hearth went out, the blankets failed, or illness struck, families understood instinctively how to respond, how to preserve what warmth remained, how to minimize exposure, and how to protect the most vulnerable. And in this relentless environment, survival was neither guaranteed nor comfortable, but it was possible, and the poor endured, layer by layer, night after night, winter after winter, shaping their bodies, minds, and practices in response to a climate that was harsh, unforgiving, and ever-present. And this endurance became a defining feature of life in the Middle Ages, where cold was both enemy and teacher, illness a constant threat, and blankets, clothing, human warmth, and vigilance, the only tools available to stave off the dangers of frost, damp, and disease. And every night, every shiver, every adjustment was part of the ongoing story of survival, memory, and resilience. And through these endless nights, people learned not just how to endure, but how to live in harmony with danger, how to turn scarcity into strategy, how to preserve life even when the odds were stacked against them. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the cold was at its fiercest and the household pressed together in blankets, clothing, and instinct, there was a profound understanding that survival depended on attention, adaptability, and shared warmth, that illness and frost were constant companions, and that the nights, though dark, bitter, and unrelenting, were also the crucible in which endurance, ingenuity, and the human spirit were forged. And this knowledge, this instinctive understanding passed from parent to child, shaped every future winter, teaching the next generation to sleep lightly, move carefully, layer strategically, huddle closely, and endure patiently, because survival was not abstract. It was a nightly, hour by hour, shiver by shiver, negotiation with the cold, the damp, and the constant threat of illness. And in these long, relentless winters, the poor learned that every small measure of warmth, every act of vigilance, and every shared layer mattered. And through these acts, life continued fragile, tenacious, and unbroken, night after night, winter after winter, in the unforgiving world of medieval survival. Shelter was more than just a place to sleep. It was the first line of defense against winter, and for the poor, it often offered only the faintest protection, because homes were small, constructed from inexpensive materials, and poorly insulated, and the cold found its way through walls, roofs, and floors, as if they were porous, living barriers against warmth. And even a slight draft could penetrate deep into the body, chilling muscles and bones, and shaping the experience of every night. Because survival depended as much on the structure as it did on blankets, clothing, and shared body heat. And yet, houses were rarely robust, often built of wattle and daub, thin timber, or stone without mortar, with thatched roofs, uneven floors, and gaps that allowed wind, snow, and moisture to intrude. And the poor could do little to improve these conditions, because labor, materials, and money were scarce. And so homes became sites of constant struggle against winter, requiring daily effort, vigilance, and improvisation. And the poor learned quickly to use every feature strategically, to position beds, pallets, and bedding in corners least exposed to drafts, to block gaps with cloth, straw, or old garments, and to huddle near fireplaces or hearths when they existed, because every measure of protection mattered, and even a small improvement in insulation could mean the difference between shivering through the night and enduring it with minimal harm. And because houses were shared by entire families, sometimes including animals, the arrangement of space became a vital strategy, with bodies, bedding, and objects placed deliberately to maximize heat retention. And in some cases, partitions made of cloth, sacks, or wood were erected to shield vulnerable members from drafts, because every layer of protection counted. In homes themselves became active participants in survival, not passive shelters, and families learned to read their structures, to understand where cold accumulated, where warmth lingered, and how to use floors, walls, and corners to their advantage, because ignorance could be fatal, and the consequences of misjudging the home's weaknesses were felt immediately in frostbite, illness, or restless, sleepless nights. And the architecture, however simple or flimsy, dictated behavior, shaping sleep patterns, movement, and strategies for warmth, because even minor shifts in furniture, bedding, or body position could trap heat or allow it to escape. And over generations, families learned the quirks of their homes, intimately internalizing its weaknesses, strengths, and vulnerabilities. And this knowledge became a vital part of winter survival, passed from parent to child, and reinforced nightly in the struggle to endure the cold. And houses were not only physical barriers, but psychological anchors, because even the thinnest wall or thatched roof represented the boundary between relative safety and the relentless outdoor chill. And children absorbed this awareness early, learning to position themselves carefully, to press into corners that retained warmth, to huddle close to parents or siblings, and to respond to subtle shifts in temperature or drafts, because the home itself demanded attention, strategy, and constant adaptation, and no night could be approached passively, because the cold was patient, unforgiving, and pervasive. And the home's weaknesses could transform the night into a trial of endurance, a test of ingenuity, and a measure of human resilience. And families responded with improvisation, blocking cracks with cloth or straw, layering floors with rushes, piling pallets higher, hanging tapestries or blankets to prevent drafts, and rearranging bedding to capture every ounce of warmth. And these strategies, though crude, were effective because they reduced exposure, concentrated heat, and allowed bodies to retain as much warmth as possible. And they became habitual, ritualized practices repeated night after night, winter after winter, forming the backbone of household survival. And through these actions, people learned to use space strategically, to anticipate weakness, and to manage the relentless demands of a home that could never fully protect them from winter, but that, when understood and used wisely, could make life survivable. And often this improvisation extended beyond the interior. Shutters were closed tightly, doors blocked with rags, snow piled strategically outside walls to reduce drafts, and small fires or embers were managed carefully to maximize warmth while minimizing risk, because every action, inside and outside the home, influenced survival, and the home itself became a dynamic participant in the night's struggle, shaping movement, behavior, and the distribution of warmth. And the poor learned to read its subtle cues, to anticipate where drafts might gather, where walls might be coldest, and how to position bodies, bedding, and materials to take advantage of every protective feature. Because in the unforgiving winters of the Middle Ages, every detail mattered, and even the smallest adjustment could mean the difference between endurance and suffering, life and illness, or sometimes life and death. And this intimate knowledge of home space and structure became ingrained over generations, forming a silent living curriculum of survival. The interior arrangement of the home became critical, because every inch of space could either trap warmth or allow cold to penetrate, and families learned to identify corners that were naturally warmer, floors that were insulated by layers of straw or rushes, and walls that, though thin, retained heat longer when shielded. And adults positioned themselves and children strategically, often placing the youngest and most vulnerable in the center of the huddle, pressing closely together, while older children and adults formed a protective perimeter, shielding core warmth from drafts that crept along walls, doors, or uneven floorboards. And this spatial choreography required constant adjustment, because as bodies shifted during sleep, blankets slipped, and gaps opened, and vigilance was necessary even in the dead of night, because the cold did not relent, and moments of inattention could result in hours of shivering, frostbite, or the onset of illness. And in addition to the arrangement of people, families layered materials strategically, burlap sacks on the floor to reduce exposure to the cold earth, straw or reeds between pallets to insulate, old garments and patchwork blankets stacked to form additional warmth, and even animal hides pressed into corners or used as coverings, because each layer trapped heat, slowed the advance of cold, and contributed to survival. And every household had its own informal techniques, tested over years of practice, adjusted to the idiosyncrasies of the building, the number of occupants, and the severity of winter. And these strategies were transmitted from parents to children, silently, through repetition, observation, and shared experience, because there was no manual, no formal instruction, only lived experience. And mistakes were costly, and the consequences of failure were immediate and tangible, felt in chilled limbs, restless nights, illness, or worse. And homes, though modest, became arenas of ingenuity, where the poor applied every resource, every instinct, because preparation for winter began long before the first frost, with repairs, reinforcements, and careful placement of bedding, and continued through each night, when families monitored temperature, adjusted positions, and evaluated the effectiveness of every layer, because the margin for error was small, and the difference between a tolerable night and a life-threatening one could be measured in inches, degrees, or the placement of a single body. And this constant negotiation with home, heat, and cold created a rhythm of survival, a pattern repeated year after year, and the architecture of the home, its walls, floors, roof, and every gap or floor beak, as familiar as the human bodies it sheltered, and adults learned to anticipate its weaknesses, adjust for them, and teach children to do the same, because ignorance could be fatal, and this tacit knowledge, embedded in the daily and nightly routines of households, became an essential component of endurance, shaping not only sleep but movement, interactions, and the overall organization of domestic life. And even the smallest changes, a shifted pallet, a misaligned blanket, an open door, were evaluated in terms of survival, because winter was unforgiving, and the home, though modest and flawed, was the central battleground, the place where strategy, instinct, and improvisation determined the outcome of the long nights, and where bodies, blankets, and materials were constantly assessed, adjusted, and optimized in a relentless effort to preserve warmth, prevent illness, and survive. And over time, these practices became embedded in family routines, behaviors, and habits, creating a cycle of knowledge, endurance, and adaptation that defined life in the harsh winters of the Middle Ages. Because survival was inseparable from the intelligent use of home, space, and every available resource, and every night was a continuous exercise in vigilance, strategy, and improvisation, where the poor became masters of their environment, learning to read its cues, exploit its strengths, mitigate its weaknesses, and endure with the fewest possible losses. And through this ceaseless practice, they preserved not only warmth and life, but the knowledge, habits, and instincts necessary to survive winters that were long, bitter, and inescapable. And these lessons, embedded in the experience of countless nights, shaped generations, teaching the young how to navigate the relentless cold, use the home, strategically layer materials effectively, and rely on collective warmth. Survival depended not on chance, but on careful attention to the home itself, and every measure taken within its walls contributed to life, health, and endurance. And in this way, the home became both a teacher and a tool, shaping the experience, behavior, and resilience of the poor in ways that were subtle, profound, and absolutely necessary. And every night, every adjustment, every layer of straw, cloth, or blanket was part of an ongoing negotiation with winter, with the structure itself, and with human vulnerability. And through this unbroken cycle, survival became possible, fragile yet tenacious, and the house, humble as it was, became a crucible of adaptation, ingenuity, and human endurance, where life and warmth were preserved through constant effort, awareness, and improvisation, night after night, winter after winter, in the relentless, unforgiving cold of the Middle Ages. In addition to interior strategies, families also adapted the exterior of their homes, because even small adjustments could influence the temperature inside, and they stacked snow against walls to block drafts, closed shutters tightly to keep wind at bay, and placed objects strategically to reduce gaps under doors or along floorboards. And even small embers from dying fires were managed carefully to prolong heat without risking sparks, because the balance between warmth and safety was delicate, and the poor became highly skilled in assessing, improvising, and responding to these small environmental factors. And over years, the experience taught them the subtle nuances of how their homes interacted with the cold, how certain corners trapped warmth longer, how floors conducted cold differently depending on their construction and coverings, and how walls, roofs, and doors could be manipulated to maximize survival. And this deep understanding of the home's physical properties, combined with strategic use of bodies, blankets, and materials, created a system of survival that was constantly monitored, adjusted, and rehearsed, because every night presented new challenges. Every shift in wind, snow, or frost required awareness and response, and complacency was dangerous. And these routines became embedded into the fabric of daily life, shaping habits, behaviors, and family roles, because survival demanded organization, vigilance, and constant negotiation with the environment. and even the smallest miscalculation could trigger hours of discomfort, illness, or worse. And in many households, children were taught to observe and how to help redistribute blankets, clothing, or straw, because the household was a shared instrument of survival, and each member's actions directly influenced the well-being of the rest. And this awareness created a profound sense of interdependence, because in a small, poorly insulated home, number one could endure alone, and collective attention, cooperation, and instinctive action became essential. And even as the cold bit through thin walls and floors, the knowledge, improvisation, and careful management of resources allowed families to mitigate its effects, to preserve warmth, and to maintain health. And through repetition, these practices became instinctive, shaping not only the behavior of individuals but the social structure, routines, and culture of households, because survival was a continuous process, not a single act, and every night demanded effort, vigilance, and strategy. And homes, though modest, became arenas of ingenuity, observation, and adaptation, where every corner, object, and layer was part of a larger system designed to maximize the chance of enduring until morning. And through this, knowledge was passed across generations, because children who survived learned the techniques of warmth, retention, body positioning, and strategic layering, and they taught their own children in turn, perpetuating a cycle of survival skills, practical wisdom, and instinctive adaptation. And this cycle defined life in the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, because without it, illness, frostbite, and death were inevitable, and even the simplest homes, managed skillfully, could become lifelines, providing the minimal protection necessary to endure long nights. And these practices were ingrained, habitual, and invisible to outsiders, but vital to those who lived through them, shaping sleep, daily routines, movement, and the psychology of winter survival, because the constant awareness of vulnerability created a discipline of observation, anticipation, and careful action. And the cumulative effect of these repeated nights was resilience, ingenuity, and endurance, forged not in comfort, but in the relentless struggle against cold, damp, and exposure. And even as families huddled together, layered bedding, and pressed bodies against one another, they understood the importance of the home as an active participant in survival, requiring interaction, attention, and management. And every night became a rehearsal of technique, strategy, and instinct, where bodies, blankets, straw, and clothing were continuously adjusted to preserve warmth, mitigate exposure, and prevent illness. And over decades, generations internalized this knowledge, forming habits and instincts that guided life, shaped perceptions, and influenced behavior long after the first frost had passed, because the experience of cold nights in modest, poorly insulated homes was formative, and homes themselves, with all their imperfections, became teachers, tools, and arenas of endurance, shaping not only physical survival, but psychological resilience, family cohesion, and practical wisdom. And through this, the poor learned that survival was not passive, but an active, constant negotiation with environment, material, and human bodies, and that every layer, every corner, every adjustment mattered, and that the home, humble as it was, could transform the relentless bite of winter into a space where life, warmth, and health could be preserved, if approached with care, vigilance, and ingenuity. And through this continuous adaptation, people endured night after night, winter after winter, in the unforgiving cold of the Middle Ages. And the knowledge, instincts, and strategies honed through these nights became essential tools passed from parent to child, forming the foundation of human resilience, survival, and ingenuity in an era where comfort was scarce, danger was constant, and the home was both battlefield and sanctuary, shaping every night, every breath, and every act of endurance necessary to survive the long, bitter winters. Clothing was the most immediate defense against winter, and for the poor, it was both precious and insufficient, because fabric was expensive, garments were scarce, and every layer had to serve multiple purposes: warmth, protection, durability, and, sometimes, modesty. And from early childhood, people learned the importance of layering, because a single tunic or thin garment was hopeless against frost that penetrated walls, floors, and straw beds, and the cold found every exposed patch of skin, chilling muscles, stiffening joints, and sapping energy. and so families became experts in the arrangement of clothing, stacking whatever was available. Woolen tunics over linen shifts, patched cloaks, fur scraps, and even hand-me-down garments from older siblings or neighbors, because every layer trapped warmth, slowed heat loss, and gave the body a fighting chance against the relentless winter. And layering was an art, learned through trial and error, passed down silently from parents to children, because understanding which combination of garments best preserved heat, which fabrics insulated effectively, and how to arrange folds, ties, and overlaps became essential knowledge for survival. And children were taught to tuck tunics tightly, to roll sleeves, to overlap skirts or trousers, and to press clothing against the body in ways that minimized gaps, because the smallest gap exposed skin to frostbite, and even a short exposure could have lasting consequences. And adults, too, carefully monitored clothing, checking children repeatedly through the night, adjusting layers, tucking collars, tightening belts, and ensuring that blankets and garments covered the most vulnerable points, because extremities, fingers, toes, ears, noses were the first to suffer, and hypothermia began at the periphery, creeping inward if not mitigated. And in addition to layering, the poor relied on improvisation, because new garments were rare and resources limited. And so every scrap of cloth, every piece of wool, and even discarded fabric became a potential source of warmth, fashioned into caps, mittens, wraps, or additional padding in beds. And animal hides, furs, and even feathers were pressed into service, because each extra layer, each insulating material, contributed to survival. And over time, families developed strategies to rotate garments, to keep dry clothing on hand if possible, and to combine layers in ways that preserved heat, even during long, frigid nights. And these strategies were reinforced by experience. And so clothing alone was never sufficient, but it was the most personal, controllable, and adaptable tool available to combat winter. And it demanded constant attention, adjustment, and improvisation, because survival depended not only on the presence of garments, because even minor exposure could allow cold to penetrate and trigger shivering, numbness, or illness, and through repetition, these arrangements became habitual, internalized as part of the nightly rhythm, guiding who lay where, which limbs pressed together, how blankets were folded, and where improvised insulation was placed, and every night became a rehearsal of technique, strategy, and attention, because the margin for error was small, and survival demanded careful orchestration of bodies, garments, and materials. And even the youngest children learned these habits intuitively, absorbing through observation and experience the subtle adjustments required to preserve warmth, because instruction was often unnecessary when the consequences of inattention were immediate and tangible, and adults monitored constantly, checking extremities, repositioning blankets, tugging garments, and ensuring that every layer remained effective, and the work was never finished, because sleep brought shifts, blankets slipped, and drafts persisted, and the cold moved silently, patient and unrelenting, penetrating where protection was weakest, testing every garment, every layer, and every measure of shared warmth, and over time, these nightly adjustments became instinctive, habitual, and crucial, shaping the very experience of winter for families, because the interplay between clothing, body heat, and improvisation defined comfort, survival, and resilience, and the act of layering was both practical and strategic. and even small lapses could initiate a chain reaction of shivering, fatigue, and illness. Because the body lost heat faster when garments were wet, and hypothermia could set in before dawn. And adults monitored children and elders carefully, checking extremities, adjusting clothing, shifting bodies, and replacing damp layers whenever possible, because attention to these details could prevent frostbite, fever, or exhaustion. And these nightly efforts became habitual, instinctive, and essential, and the knowledge of how to manage clothing, moisture, and body heat was transmitted silently through observation, practice, and repeated experience, because survival demanded skill, attention, and careful judgment, and children learned these lessons quickly, internalizing the importance of layering, pressing garments, adjusting positions, monitoring others, and improvising with available materials, because the cold was relentless, patient, and unforgiving, and every mistake had consequences, and the night was long, stretching hours into discomfort, fatigue, and the slow encroachment of frost. And yet, the poor endured, drawing on skill, ingenuity, and collective effort, because survival depended not on luck, but on careful orchestration of clothing, bodies, bedding, and environment. And even the simplest act, tucking a tunic, pressing a blanket, rotating a body, could significantly alter the outcome of the night. And over years, these skills became deeply ingrained, shaping behavior, habits, instincts, and family dynamics, because the survival of each member depended on the vigilance, skill, and cooperation of all. And the body itself became a tool, source of warmth, and monitor of temperature, responding instinctively to drafts, dampness, and exposure. And the interplay between clothing, body heat, and improvisation became a central narrative of survival, shaping experience, psychology, and daily routines, because preparation for winter began long before nightfall, with attention to garments, materials, household arrangements, and resources, and continued throughout the night as layers shifted, temperatures fluctuated, and vigilance was required to maintain warmth, prevent illness, and endure until dawn. And the night itself became a laboratory of survival, where families tested techniques, refined strategies, and taught the next generation the art of layering, pressing, adjusting, and improvising. And every success reinforced knowledge, resilience, and instinct, while every failure offered lessons, however painful, about the limits of material, the importance of vigilance, and the relentless nature of winter. And through this lived experience, generations of the poor internalized a profound understanding of how to protect the body, manage clothing, preserve warmth, and survive freezing nights. And these practices, repeated for decades, shaped entire households, behaviors, and cultures, because the knowledge of layering, shared heat, improvisation, and adjustment was essential for endurance, health, and survival. And over time, these strategies became instinctive, guiding sleep, movement, and interaction, because the cold demanded constant attention, and the smallest lapse could have immediate consequences. And even as exhaustion threatened, adults and children alike continued to monitor, adjust, layer, and improvise, because the night was long, the cold persistent, and survival depended on careful, continuous action. And through these repeated nights, families cultivated resilience, ingenuity, and instinctive knowledge that became part of the very fabric of life, shaping the experience of winter, defining the rhythms of daily life, and teaching the next generation how to endure, layer, and survive. And every garment fold, adjustment, and pressed body mattered profoundly, because survival in the harsh, unforgiving winters of the Middle Ages was not passive, comfortable, or guaranteed, but achieved through careful management, attention, and skill, night after night, winter after winter, in a continuous living and deeply human negotiation with cold, damp, exposure, and the environment. And through these efforts, life persisted, fragile, tenacious, and resilient, maintained through the skillful orchestration of clothing, bodies, shared warmth, improvisation, and environmental awareness, in the unrelenting struggle for warmth, health, and survival that defined the experience of the poor during medieval winters. And in this struggle, they endured, persisted, and transmitted the knowledge, skills, and instincts necessary to survive the long, bitter nights that shaped the rhythm, behavior, and endurance of entire generations. Nighttime was the most dangerous period of winter, because darkness amplified the cold, and the hours stretched endlessly, testing endurance, patience, and vigilance. And for the poor, the night was not simply a time for rest, but a continuous exercise in survival, a period where every movement, adjustment, and observation mattered, because exposure to frost or damp could quickly lead to shivering, fatigue, and illness. And every family member, from the youngest child to the eldest adult, played a role in this nightly negotiation with the environment, because survival depended on collective effort, careful monitoring, and instinctive responses. And adults remained partially alert even as they tried to rest, listening for subtle sounds, monitoring shifts in temperature, and observing the positions of children, elders, and bedding, because any minor changer, blanket sliding, a body shifting, a draft slipping through a gap, could compromise warmth and trigger shivering or hypothermia. And the body itself responded to these conditions with shivers, constricted circulation, and increased fatigue, signaling danger. And families learned to interpret these signs, adjusting positions, layering garments, or repositioning bodies, because the night demanded constant attention, and small, precise interventions could make the difference between enduring until dawn or suffering through hours of exposure. And these routines became instinctive over time, because repeated experience taught children and adults how to anticipate the cold, how to respond to changes in body temperature, how to redistribute blankets, and how to press together for shared warmth. And even the placement of limbs, the curling of the body, or the rotation of sleepers on a straw pallet could alter the retention of heat and mitigate the risk of illness. And vigilance was continuous, because the cold was patient, creeping along walls, floors, and bedding, finding gaps in clothing, blankets, and insulation. And the consequences of inattention were immediate and tangible, felt in discomfort, shivering, and the gradual loss of warmth. And sometimes this led to frostbite or the onset of illness, which could be slow to manifest but severe in its effects. And over years, families refined these nightly routines, learning the subtle patterns of how heat dispersed in the home, how drafts formed, how bodies interacted with blankets and garments, and how small adjustments could maximize warmth, because every detail mattered. And the survival of each member depended on this careful orchestration, observation, and management. And children absorbed these skills early, learning to monitor their own bodies, adjust their clothing, and move with precision within the huddle of family bodies, because instinctive vigilance became essential for enduring the long hours. And the night itself became a teacher, demonstrating where cold penetrated, how blankets and garments shifted, and how bodies could be used strategically to generate and conserve warmth. And this knowledge was not abstract, but immediate, embodied, and practiced nightly, because every night presented a test, and every night required careful attention to position, layering, and environmental conditions. And these practices created rhythms, rituals, and habits that structured sleep, movement, and interaction within the household, because vigilance, adjustment, and improvisation were inseparable from survival. And even subtle cues, like the sound of shifting straw, the creak of a wooden floor, or the movement of a blanket, were interpreted and acted upon instinctively, because failure to respond could allow cold to penetrate, initiating cycles of shivering, fatigue, and sickness. And over time, these routines became deeply ingrained, shaping not only sleep but broader aspects of daily life, because preparation for the night began well before dusk, with attention to bedding, clothing, household arrangements, and resources, and continued into the long hours of darkness, as bodies shifted layers, slipped, and vigilance remained essential. And even small successes like keeping a child's toes warm, redistributing blankets, or adjusting a huddle to trap more heat were celebrated silently, as victories in the ongoing struggle with winter. And every night, every adjustment, every repositioning reinforced knowledge, instincts, and skills that were vital for survival, because the cold did not relent, and the hours were long. And even in sleep, bodies remained partially alert, sensing drafts, temperature changes, and subtle movements that could compromise warmth. And through repetition, these practices became instinctive, forming a tacit curriculum of survival that guided behavior, awareness, and interaction, because the night demanded constant attention, and survival required skill, vigilance, and improvisation. And the poor developed this expertise, not through instruction, but through lived experience, observation, and practice, because each night presented immediate consequences for inattention, and the body, sensitive to cold, damp, and fatigue, became both a monitor and a participant in survival signaling danger, guiding adjustments and shaping routines, and the knowledge of these nightly practices was transmitted silently from parent to child, forming generational expertise in vigilance, layering, huddling, and the careful orchestration of clothing, bedding, bodies, and home space, because survival was inseparable from these skills, and the long hours of winter night became a crucible in which resilience, ingenuity, and endurance were forged, and every movement, adjustment, and intervention, no matter how small, contributed to the preservation of warmth, health, and life, because the stakes were immediate, tangible, and profound, and the night demanded mastery of the interplay between body, clothing, bedding, and environment, and through this mastery, families endured, repeated, and refined the routines that allowed survival, night after night, winter after winter, in the relentless, unforgiving conditions of the Middle Ages. The strategies of nighttime vigilance extended beyond the immediate household, because neighbors and communities sometimes played indirect roles in survival. Through the sharing of knowledge, observation, and occasional material aid, and adults discussed what worked, what failed, and how best to layer garments, arrange bedding, and manage shared body heat, because the cumulative experience of multiple households became a source of wisdom, passed orally and through demonstration, and these communal exchanges reinforced individual expertise, because while survival was primarily local and household-based, insight into techniques, materials, and routines could spread, improving outcomes for all, and even small insights, like the optimal placement of blankets, the layering sequence for warmth, or how to position a child to maximize shared heat, were invaluable because nights were long conditions. Harsh and small adjustments had significant impact, and the poor became meticulous in observing, analyzing, and adjusting, because the consequences of inattention were immediate: shivering, fatigue, illness, and sometimes irreversible harm. And bodies themselves became instruments of detection, instinctively responding to drafts, moisture, temperature changes, and shifts in bedding or clothing, signaling danger before conscious awareness. Because instinctive vigilance was essential, and the repetition of these nights embedded habits, routines, and reflexive responses that became second nature, guiding sleep, movement, and interaction in ways both subtle and profound. And the night itself became a teacher, revealing weak points in bedding, clothing, and household structures, demonstrating how bodies, blankets, and garments could be arranged to trap heat, and showing the importance of constant attention, adjustment, and improvisation, because the cold was relentless, patient, and unforgiving, and even minor lapses could trigger shivering, numbness, and the gradual loss of warmth. Because preparation began before nightfall, with inspection of clothing, bedding, home repairs, and household organization, and continued throughout the night, as adults and children adjusted positions, redistributed blankets, and monitored the most vulnerable members, because survival required both foresight and active management. because survival depended on the precise orchestration of multiple variables, and the night itself became a crucible, testing endurance, skill, and attention, shaping experience, behavior, and the rhythms of life, because repeated exposure embedded knowledge, habit, and instinct that guided families through each winter. Adjusting a huddle to trap more heat was vital, because survival required constant, skilled action, and failure was costly, sometimes irreversible. And in the unforgiving winters of medieval Europe, this knowledge, practiced tangible and sometimes severe, and even minor miscalculations, due to little preparing meals too early or consuming food that did not provide sufficient warmth could compromise nighttime survival, amplifying shivering fatigue and vulnerability, and over time, preserve warmth and sustain the body through the night. And these practices were honed over years, passed from parent to child, becoming instinctive, habitual, and deeply embedded in the rhythms of life. And vigilance and families adjusted, constantly responding to scarcity, changing availability, and the varying needs of each member, because children, the elderly, because survival demanded ingenuity, discipline, and constant awareness. And through these repeated nights, the family internalized the delicate balance of nourishment, cracks between boards or stones that allowed drafts to slip inside, and floors that were often dirt, stone, or packed clay, cold to the touch and relentlessly sucking warmth from bodies. And every household adapted in small but vital ways, using whatever materials were at hand to plug gaps, layer walls, and create a microclimate of relative warmth, because the cold outside was merciless, impatient and unforgiving, and even small lapses in shelter allowed frost to creep through, chilling blankets, garments, and the bodies of sleepers, and the hearth, when available, became the heart of survival, the source of warmth, light, and comfort. And families learned to orchestrate every element of their home to preserve heat, minimize drafts, and protect their most vulnerable members. Because failure could mean shivering, restless nights, illness, or worse. And the act of building and maintaining shelter became an ongoing task. Because materials wore down, thatch sagged, gaps widened, and moisture seeped in, requiring constant vigilance, repair, and improvisation. And adults learned to position beds, pallets, and blankets strategically, away from drafts, near residual warmth, and close to other bodies. Because even slight adjustments could improve insulation, reduce heat loss, and enhance the capacity to endure. And children observed and participated in these adjustments, learning how to recognize cold spots, how to adjust bedding, and how to use their bodies to block drafts, because instinctive knowledge was essential for survival. And families improvised constantly, using extra blankets, straw, rags, and even furniture to create barriers, insulate walls, or elevate sleeping surfaces from cold floors. Because the combination of layered bedding, huddling, and careful use of limited heat sources amplified the effect of the shelter. And the hearth, though often small and inefficient, was tended continuously, because embers could be banked to provide warmth through the night, wood rationed carefully, and every spark and flame because fuel was scarce and warmth was precious. And families learned to judge when to stoke the fire, when to preserve embers, and how to balance warmth with fuel conservation, because both were critical to enduring the long winter nights. And even small innovations, placing stones or clay near the hearth to radiate heat slowly, creating windbreaks from furniture or bundled rags, or stacking fuel to maximize efficiency, could have measurable effects on comfort, endurance, and survival. And over years, these strategies became instinctive, habitual, and essential, forming the tacit knowledge of how to manipulate the home environment, conserve heat, and protect the household from the cold. Because the margin for error was small, and even minor lapses could allow frost to penetrate, chilling bodies, bedding, and clothing, and increasing the risk of illness, shivering, and sleep disruption. And the rhythm of the household was shaped by these concerns, with activities, chores, and preparation timed to ensure that shelter and fire were optimized before nightfall. Because preparation was inseparable from survival, and the night itself was an ongoing challenge, as temperatures dropped, wind howled, and the body's heat slowly dissipated through clothing, bedding, and insufficient shelter. And families continuously monitored conditions, adjusting layers, repositioning sleepers, adding insulation, and tending the hearth to preserve warmth, because vigilance, skill, and improvisation were essential. And the home became both a physical and psychological fortress, where small adjustments, careful observation, and strategic action determined comfort, endurance, and survival. And children absorbed these lessons through participation, observation, and repetition, learning how to arrange bedding, monitor drafts, conserve fuel, and respond instinctively to signs of cold, because instinctive awareness was crucial for enduring the night. And the act of survival extended beyond the physical, encompassing attention, judgment, and strategic thinking, because poor households were constantly negotiating limited resources, environmental challenges, and the body's needs. And the interaction between shelter, clothing, bedding, and fire created a complex system in which every variable mattered, and failure in one element could compromise the others, reducing warmth, increasing fatigue, and risking illness. And over generations, these practices were refined, transmitted, and internalized, because survival depended on both knowledge and execution. And the repeated cycles of winter nights, long hours, and persistent cold-shaped behavior, routines, and instincts, embedding the understanding of shelter, heat, and vigilance into every member of the household. And the poorest households became highly skilled, inventive, and adaptive, using every available resource: straw, rags, old garments, furniture, stones, clay, and fuel to maximize warmth, minimize exposure, and protect the body from the relentless cold. And this knowledge became both practical and instinctive, because failure had immediate consequences, and the ability to manipulate the home environment determined endurance, health, and survival. And even minor improvements, repairing a gap, adding straw under a pallet, positioning bodies near residual warmth, or conserving embers could significantly increase the chances of surviving the night. And through this continuous, active management of shelter, fire, and the home environment, families endured night after night, winter after winter, learning the subtle interplay between insulation, warmth, vigilance, and resourcefulness, because survival required constant attention, skill, and adaptation. And the cumulative effect of these repeated nights was the cultivation of resilience, knowledge, and instinct, because the body, home, bedding, and through this daily, nightly, and generational practice, households developed the expertise, ingenuity, and endurance necessary to navigate freezing nights, conserve warmth, and protect their most vulnerable members, passing this essential knowledge silently from parent to child, night after night, season after season, embedding the rhythm of vigilance, adjustment, and survival into the very fabric of daily life, because the home, though simple and often inadequate, became the crucible of winter survival, a space where skill, improvisation, attention, and care determined life, warmth, and endurance, and where the relentless cold was confronted with ingenuity, coordination, and the shared effort of the family, shaping behavior, instincts, and experience in ways that define survival, resilience, and the human capacity to endure the harsh, unforgiving winters of the medieval world. In addition to basic structural adaptations, families developed complex routines around the hearth, because fire was both fragile and essential, and tending it required constant attention, skill, and foresight, and adults carefully managed fuel, stacking wood to maximize airflow, preserving embers for slow, long-lasting heat, and regulating flames to provide warmth without consuming supplies too quickly, because fuel was scarce. And even a single misstep could leave the household exposed to cold through the long night, and children learned to participate safely, observing how embers radiated heat, how smoke indicated draft problems, and how coals could be banked to release warmth slowly, because this knowledge was vital, an instinctive understanding of fire, its behavior, and its interaction with shelter and bodies became a necessary skill for survival, and the poor adapted creatively, using stones or clay around embers to store heat, positioning beds or pallets near residual warmth, and arranging furniture, rags, and straw to block drafts while reflecting heat into living spaces. Because every degree of retained warmth could mean the difference between comfort and suffering, or health and illness, and even small improvisations, tucking rags into gaps, and these nightly routines, repeated for decades, became internalized, instinctive, and essential, guiding sleep, movement, and interaction. And the home itself became a living system, where clothing, bedding, bodies, hearth, walls, floors, and improvisation all interacted, because each variable influenced the others, and survival required constant adjustment, observation, and skill, and adults coordinated every element with care, ensuring that the most vulnerable children, the elderly, the sequer positioned strategically, received extra layers, and were monitored continuously, because their survival was critical, and even small improvements in their environment, an extra blanket, proximity to residual heat, or additional insulation could significantly increase their chances of enduring the night, and the youngest members absorbed these practices, silently learning to press together, adjust garments, huddle strategically, and observe the patterns of warmth, because instinctive knowledge was essential, and survival was both a learned skill and a constant performance repeated night after night, winter after winter, because every night presented a test, and every action tending the hearth, adjusting bedding, managing fuel, redistributing bodies, improvising insulation contributed to warmth, endurance, and life, and over time, these routines embedded practical wisdom, skill, and resilience, shaping behavior, instincts, and the rhythms of household life. Because repeated practice in response to immediate consequences formed an embodied knowledge that guided all interactions with fire, shelter, and bodies, and even the act of entering sleep became a careful negotiation, a balance between rest and vigilance, because bodies remained partially alert to drafts, falling temperatures, and shifts in bedding or clothing, and the smallest movement could compromise insulation or shared warmth. And through this continuous, attentive engagement, families developed expertise that allowed them to endure long nights in fragile homes, improvising solutions, conserving fuel, and maximizing warmth from limited resources. And these practices became deeply internalized, shaping perceptions of space, fire, and warmth. Because survival required both immediate action and long-term understanding, and the poor became masters of the subtle interplay between environmental conditions, human physiology, but experience and observation taught instinctive skill, awareness, and judgment, and even the poorest households cultivated resilience, ingenuity, and coordination, because the cold was relentless, patient, and unforgiving, and survival depended on active management, continuous attention, and careful orchestration of shelter, fire, bedding, clothing, and bodies. And the night itself became a crucible in which skill, instinct, and endurance were forged, because repeated exposure, careful observation, and adaptive response shaped generations, teaching them to read their environment, preserve warmth, and protect the most vulnerable. And the home, though simple, leaky, and cold by modern standards, became a carefully managed system of survival, where every element, from walls to straw, embers to garments, bodies to bedding, was optimized, adjusted, and monitored with skill, care, and experience. Because life in winter was fragile, the margin for error small, and every action, adjustment, and innovation mattered profoundly. And over decades, these nightly routines, improvisations, and practices created embodied knowledge, resilience, and instinct that guided households through the harshest conditions, because the poor endured, adapted, and transmitted vital survival skills silently from parent to child, generation after generation, night after night, winter after winter, ensuring that despite scarcity, cold, and exposure, life persisted, sustained by vigilance, skill, ingenuity, and the tireless management of home, hearth, and human bodies. And through this unbroken cycle, the art of enduring winter, of preserving warmth, and of navigating the relentless hours of darkness became an essential, lived expertise, shaping the experience, behavior, and endurance of entire households, because survival in the Middle Ages depended not on luck or comfort, but on careful observation, skillful management, and the continuous attentive orchestration of shelter, fire, bedding, clothing, and shared human warmth. And through these repeated practices, families endured the bitterest nights, maintained life, and cultivated resilience, tenacity, and knowledge that defined the lived experience of winter, forming the hidden foundation upon which survival, health, and human endurance depended. And in this tireless, meticulous, and deeply human effort, life persisted, fragile, tenacious, and resilient, guided by instinct, skill, and the unbroken rhythm of vigilance, adjustment, and survival in the harsh, unforgiving winters of the medieval world. The final stage of survival during the harshest winters of the Middle Ages was not simply about enduring the cold, but about the complex, continuous interplay of all elements that had been developed over centuries of necessity, because the poor had to integrate clothing, bedding, shelter, fire, food, and energy management into a seamless system of life-sustaining routines, and the rhythm of these practices became instinctive, habitual, and deeply ingrained in daily existence, shaping not only behavior but perception, judgment, and the very experience of winter, because survival was a skill honed over decades, transmitted silently and practically from parent to child, generation to generation, with every failure and every success reinforcing knowledge, resilience, and instinct. and the night itself, long, dark, and merciless, became a crucible in which skill, vigilance, and endurance were tested and refined. Because there was no margin for error, no room for complacency, and even small lapses could result in shivering, fatigue, illness, or worse. And families learned to anticipate, adjust, and respond constantly, because the cold outside and the drafts within their homes demanded continuous engagement, observation, and action, and the body itself became a guide and a monitor, signaling temperature changes, dampness, or insufficient warmth, prompting subtle interventions, repositioning, layering, and huddling, because instinctive responsiveness was essential. And over time, these nightly practices embedded an embodied understanding of survival, where every movement, every adjustment, and every improvised solution contributed to life, warmth, and health. And the poor developed a mastery of improvisation, using whatever was at hand: straw, rags, old garments, furniture, stones, clay, embers, to optimize the home environment, trap heat, block drafts, and protect vulnerable members, because ingenuity was as critical as endurance. And the repetition of these strategies created a deep internalized expertise that guided the household through every winter. And this expertise was holistic, because clothing could only do so much. Without bedding, bedding required layering and huddling to be effective, and both depended on the careful management of fire, shelter, and energy from food and drink. And families became acutely aware of the interdependence of every element, because failure in one area compromised the others. And over decades, this intimate understanding became instinctive, shaping habits, attention, and behavior in subtle because their survival was directly dependent on skillful engagement with every aspect of winter living, and every night became a rehearsal, a test, and a reinforcement of knowledge, where adults orchestrated bodies, blankets, clothing, fire, and shelter in a careful dance, rotating bodies for shared warmth, preserving embers for gradual heat, layering clothing strategically, redistributing bedding, and improvising insulation, because each action contributed to endurance, health, and life. And over time, these routines shaped perceptions of space, temperature, and risk, creating a tacit curriculum of winter survival that guided instinct, judgment, and behavior, because the poor had no safety nets, and each night was an immediate and tangible test, where the cold was patient, relentless, and unforgiving, and every degree of retained warmth, every conserved ember, every strategically placed blanket or huddle mattered profoundly. And the repetition of these nights instilled resilience, ingenuity, and confidence, because survival was continuous, learned experientially, and embedded in the very rhythms of life. And through these repeated cycles, households cultivated not only practical skill but also psychological endurance, because the anticipation of long hours, the mastery of vigilance, and the knowledge of how to respond to every subtle sign of cold, dampness, or exposure provided a sense of control. In a world defined by scarcity, harsh conditions, and unpredictability, and the interplay of clothing, bedding, shelter, fire, food, and vigilance became an integrated system where adjustments in one area enhanced performance in another, and families learned to optimize resources, coordinate efforts, and monitor each other continuously, because the survival of one depended on the survival of all. Because the cumulative knowledge of repeated winters ensured that children became adept at huddling, layering, monitoring body heat, tending fire, and improvising shelter, internalizing these lessons as instinctive skill, judgment, and awareness. And the long, bitter nights became both teacher and test, shaping perception, coordination, and instinct, because survival was inseparable from experience, practice, and attentive management. And the household became a carefully orchestrated system of interdependent variables, where bodies, clothing, bedding, shelter, and through constant practice, the poor mastered this complex system, surviving winters that would otherwise have been fatal. And even the simplest improvisation, pressing garments, redistributing straw, elevating pallets, preserving embers, or adjusting body position had measurable consequences, amplifying warmth, preserving energy, and extending endurance, and the repetition of these actions embedded instinct, skill, and confidence in every member, because survival required continuous attention, skillful execution, and the ability to respond to subtle cues in the environment and the body. And the experience of winter became not just a physical challenge, but a formative influence on psychology, behavior, and culture, because endurance, vigilance, and ingenuity were practiced nightly, transmitted silently, and embedded in daily life, shaping the rhythms, priorities, and social interactions of the household, and even in the most modest homes. These practices ensured survival, because the combination of human skill, attention, and shared effort created warmth, protected health, and preserved life in ways that no single element could achieve alone. And the lessons of these nights were learned experientially, passed from parent to child, and became instinctive, forming a continuum of knowledge. Improvising, insulation contributed directly to survival, health, and endurance. And through these repeated nights, households cultivated not only practical skill, but also emotional resilience, confidence, and trust in one another, because cooperation, vigilance, and careful observation were inseparable from survival. And even small successes, keeping a child warm, conserving fuel, maintaining residual heat, or optimizing bedding arrangements, reinforced knowledge, skill, and instinct, creating a sense of mastery in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving world. And this mastery became part of the identity, culture, and lived experience of the poor, because enduring winter was not passive, but active, requiring constant attention, judgment, improvisation, and coordination. And over time, this knowledge and skill formed a hidden legacy, transmitted silently across generations, because survival was inseparable from experience. And through these repeated cycles of preparation, vigilance, adjustment, and endurance, life persisted, tenacious, resilient, and deeply human, shaped by the continuous, careful orchestration of clothing, bedding, shelter, fire, food, energy, and shared warmth. And even in the most bitter, relentless nights, families endured, adapted, and thrived in ways that revealed profound ingenuity, skill, and resilience, because survival was the result of knowledge embedded in practice, instinct, and attention. And through this knowledge, the poor conquered the winter night, preserving life, health, and warmth through relentless, patient, and unyielding effort. And the lessons learned, the skills acquired, and the instincts developed became part of the living, silent inheritance of households, guiding behavior, shaping endurance, and ensuring that even the harshest, coldest, and longest nights could be endured, navigated, and survived, night after night, winter after winter, generation after generation, culminating in a legacy of human resilience. Preserving warmth, life, and hope through the darkest, coldest hours, and leaving a hidden history of survival that underpins the lived experience of medieval winters. A legacy of knowledge, skill, and resilience passed silently, embodied in instinct, practice, and shared memory, shaping the survival, endurance, and character of generations who faced the unforgiving cold with courage, resourcefulness, and unwavering determination. Good night, traveler. May the long hours of darkness be gentle on you. May warmth find its way to your bones, and may your dreams be soft and untroubled. Rest well, letting the quiet of the night carry you far from cold and hardship, into peace, comfort, and the slow unfolding of morning light. Sleep deeply, and wake renewed, ready to face a new day with strength and calm. Sweet dreams, and safe travels through the hours of night.